Recording now.
Very good. So I'll call to order this September 8th, 2021 special meeting of the Town Plan and Zoning Commission of the Town of Fairfield. This is a meeting that we're holding in our capacity as planners, a planning session. First, I believe we should seat Commissioner Gordon in place of one of the regular members. And the first agenda item on our discussion is our planning discussion, and within that, it's the discussion of downtown TOD regulation proposals. So, Mr. Wendt, if you could present that item.
Yeah, this is going to be a team effort tonight. First, I just want to say there's two components on our agenda this evening for discussion. The first, obviously, as you just said, Mr. Chairman, is a review of draft regulation proposals for the Center Design Business District. This draft is a follow-up to a planning meeting that this commission held on May 25th and reflects what we thought was consensus amongst the commission at that meeting. Certainly not unanimous, but at least, excuse me, general consensus. I don't see a huge participation list here, but I just wanted to make clear for the public that this is not a public hearing this evening. It's a vetting amongst the commission of what you might think we might wish to move forward with for a public hearing proposal. Before we can, or this commission can approve any regulation amendment, we have to have a full public hearing. That is not being held tonight. We're just having an administrative discussion, and should we proceed to that step, there will be a full public hearing at a subsequent date. So I just wanted to make that clear for anybody that might be listening, and I will turn it over to Emmeline to walk through our proposal. And mindful that we did have a discussion amongst the commission back in May, and we're hopeful that we've captured, and we can talk about it more once we go through the presentation. So with that, I'll let Emmeline walk you through the regulation proposal, and then we can go back to discussion mode.
Okay, can everybody see the screen okay? Yep, okay. All right. So as Jim mentioned, these were proposed regulations that we had talked about back at the end of May. And, really this goes back even further to our initial TOD, our TOD plan for Metro Center in terms of some of the early conversations about what we also wanted to see in downtown. Part of what was part of the discussion was really trying to simplify the residential percentage by just simply mandating commercial on the ground floor. Jim and I, in discussions today, we realized that we should probably strengthen the language a little bit in terms of, the intent is not to have ground floor, parking, like we don't want to see kind of the stilt buildings. But in terms of thinking about how our zoning regulations inform the form that we'd like to see, this does go back to not having to kind of get into the weeds of, is this 70%, is it 60% residential, but just simply saying on the ground floor, we want commercial development. And then everything up above within the envelope that we talk about in terms of the form that we want to see for the central business district, the rest of it can be residential, and we don't want to have to get into the weeds and looking at degrees of percentages. The other thing that was very clear by the board is that we really should increase the percentage of affordable. And as a reminder, for any development that has over 10 units, we normally require 10% affordable at 80% area median income. However, in the central business district, as well as for the Metro Center development that was approved, the conversation included increasing that to 12%. So that's part of this regulation amendment proposal as well. We are also proposing reducing the number of stories that is presently allowed within this district from 5 to 4, with an overall height increase to 52 feet in order to accommodate a 15-foot first floor commercial height, which was strongly indicated as desirable ground floor commercial in terms of when we did our transit-oriented development study. The other thing that we realized that we had to do was also increase our floor area ratio from 200% to 300%, and this does exclude both basements and subterranean parking, from that calculation, since it's not massing that's above grade. Part of looking at the regulations was also a discussion about just the continuous street edge, not wanting to see gaps between the buildings per se where we don't have to, so it can provide, this really contiguous pedestrian experience. So, the heart of, kind of behind where the community theater is, we are proposing a 0 side yard setback for properties that front Umpqua Road. However, and maybe I think Mark Barnhart can speak to kind of the history of this. There is an understanding that for properties that face Donnelly Walk, there's a real intention to help that be more of like a pedestrian plaza. So we are proposing that a grade level plaza or a grade level storefront be provided facing Donnelly Walk. We're also proposing a 0 street setback for properties on Umpqua Road or Sanford Street. Arguably, if we talk about I think Jim and I have had internal conversations about this for other commercial districts, that in order to maintain a pedestrian oriented commercial frontage, perhaps we should be looking also at whether or not we want to reduce, the setback requirement from the street as well, for other districts. But what we're proposing here, in order to kind of continue what is already present, is to have that 0 street setback on Umpqua and Sanford. So we provided this visual example, understanding that. Oh, I'm sorry. Somebody have a.
That means there will be a sidewalk, though.
Oh yes.
6 or 8 foot sidewalk.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Well, there is a sidewalk requirement because, generally where the property starts, there's an additional distance of right of way before you hit the curb edge. I mean, that could also be part of the consideration too. I think certainly I've seen regulations where, if the goal is that you want a certain width of sidewalk, and, you could add a provided clause that says, 0 setback provided that at minimum, an 8 foot sidewalk is provided or 6 foot sidewalk is provided. We can certainly talk about that as a potential option. Okay. Okay. So I provided this photograph just kind of as an example. I know this is more than the stories that we're talking about in the proposed regulation change, but it helps kind of speak to what we heard from you in terms of that May meeting. Is 3 stories being on the same plane tends to be fine in terms of the scale of what's already in the central business district, but that 4th story, in order to kind of maintain better massing with what's already in the district, that 4th story should be set back an additional amount. We put in 10 feet because we feel like at least with a 10-foot depth, you can get some usable patio space up there. We can certainly discuss whether that should be a little bit deeper. But we think 10 feet at minimum is enough to, give a different scale so that it really feels like a 3-story in lieu of a 4-story building from most pedestrian views and street edges. So again, that photograph just provides a visual example of that with a slightly bigger building, but it gives you the idea of what it is the regulation is trying to promote. The other proposal is for parking. So parking proposed at either 1 space per bedroom or 1.5 spaces per unit, whichever is less. So if it's a 2-bedroom unit, for example, they would only have to park it at 1.5 spaces. This is consistent with the other developments that have been approved in transit-oriented areas of town. Jim, am I switching over to you? Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Just to kind of recap, and I'm sorry, Meg, before we'll circle back for a second, but just, we provided this in the materials, the agenda, the regulation, and kind of written in kind of tabular form. We just kind of walked through it on this PowerPoint. But the biggest, again, the idea here is we did have a private application to amend the regulations, and the commission wanted to advance the dialogue to get to a point, hopefully, where there was a framework that the commission could be comfortable with. So to better guide reinvestment and looking for viable mixed-use options as opposed to other alternatives. So the main thrust of this, and I think where we thought there was consensus from the last meeting generally, in the change from what we permit presently, is that this would eliminate the current 50% maximum residential occupancy in maximum of 2 stories of residential, and eliminate that limitation, provided that there's ground story commercial. We thought that there was general consensus for that last time. Likewise, increasing the percentage of affordable housing from 10% to 12% of the number of units, reducing the height that we presently permit at 5 stories down to 4, with the floor height limitations that Emmeline talked about, increasing the total allowed square footage of a building as a percentage of lot size from 2 to 3, and then tweaking the setbacks. And there was some, again, there was a lot of discussion, I think agreement, that if the 4th story is going to be permitted, there need to be additional setback above the 3rd floor. And so that's kind of the differences highlighted quickly where we are between what our present regulations say and what we might wish to consider. So that's our quick overview, and we're happy to talk about questions or issues or how we're going to handle this, Mr. Chairman. Maybe at this point, Emmeline, it might be easier to take the shared screen down so we can see.
Well, thank you very much, Jim and Emmeline. I think at this point, I'd like to open it up to a discussion of commissioners of their reactions and thoughts on the proposed regulation change. And I certainly have some thoughts and questions myself, but I saw a couple of hands. I saw Commissioner Corcoran's. Forgive me if I missed anybody else's hand who was earlier. Commissioner Corcoran.
Yes, I wanted to. We got the chart that the PowerPoint presentation doesn't seem to exactly follow the chart. Are they supposed to be the same?
Yeah, they're consistent, and we can pull that up if you want to see the text of the reg, and we can walk through that if you think that would be helpful.
No, as long as what we're seeing in the PowerPoint is what we're talking about, even if it doesn't agree with what's in the chart.
I think the only thing that we need to clarify, and this was born out of a discussion today, I think that Jim and I had, is we do feel like we need to just add one very strong sentence in there that requires that commercial ground floor square footage, not numerically, but just, whether we want it to be like 1/3 of the floor plate or whatever it might be, with the recognition that usually at the grade level, there's some sort of access to that has to happen. So, we'll have to, that will have to be something that we clarify later, but this is just really to confirm that we are hopefully moving in the right direction for getting ready to draft something that then we have a public hearing on.
So the one of the requirements I see is that there be a storefront on the Donnelly Walk. The proposal we got didn't have that. It had parking there, I think. Would the regulation say that it had to be all storefronts on Donnelly Walk? These would be across from the other storefronts on Donnelly Walk.
Yeah, the trade-off, what we're looking for here is in order to go to 0 setback on both sides, we're saying that there needs to be some sort of interface with Donnelly Walk that either be some sort of grade level plaza that interacts with that walkway or a storefront. I don't think it has to be for the entire length of the building. If there's a ground floor storefront, we would expect there to be, windows and a door, interacting with Donnelly Walk. But if the commercial occupancy isn't the entire depth of the building, then it wouldn't be, the entire depth of Donnelly Walk. But at least where there is commercial occupancy, we want that interface, so it's not just a blank wall, along that public walkway.
I think we should be definite about how much storefront there should be. I mean, in a way, we're designing this particular building, right? Because this won't apply to anything else.
Well, no, it would. I don't expect that there's going to be a sudden rush for redevelopment, but there are parcels that might, be ripe for consideration. But yes, there is a particular parcel that is ripe in looking to redevelop, and that's what we're reacting to. The commission likes certain of the proposals that were made and weren't so crazy about others, and we're trying to find perhaps some middle ground. In the pushback to 0 on both sides, what we're saying, if you want to go to 0 to keep that continuous, and you front on Uncle Road, then you need to have some kind of interaction so it brings that public space
right
to life.
By the way, I like this. I'm not against it at all.
Yep.
So I'm just trying to figure out what happens. We're going to have more storefronts on Donnelly Walk or a plaza, but that's going to eliminate the parking from the proposal we got. And I noticed in another place that it says that parking has to be on contiguous land if it's not on the land proposed. Do we have enough places for parking?
Well, that's going to be the big design consideration for them. That the building that we saw, and I don't want to. That's not the current building, but it's likely going to be a similar proposal if they come back to have a commercial presence on Uncle Road, but not for the entire depth of the lot. That because of their need, this building was elevated with some surface parking. So I wouldn't expect for the entire length of the parcel that there would be an interface with Donnelly Walk, but there would need to be some where the building is. That's what we're looking for. We need perhaps to talk about if you think to me a certain minimum depth of commercial storefront that you would want or demand, where the regulation is silent at present as to a minimum square footage or percentage of commercial occupancy, other than it's going to be required to be on the ground floor. We could consider some minimum depth of commercial space that's required, but given the constraints and the ability, and to provide parking, I wouldn't expect that the entirety of the footprint of the property can be occupied building, because there has to be some room for parking.
So, sorry, I'm just one more. So the regulation starts out by saying residential uses provided it shall not be located on the ground floor.
Right.
Does that mean the entire ground floor could be parking?
Well, that's what we are suggesting that we need to clarify, that there be, provided that there be some, their ground floor commercial occupancy. So that's, right now, we could leave it open-ended and saying, residential uses provided it shall not be on the ground floor, provided that the ground floor, maintains commercial occupancy. And it's up to you whether you think that there should be some minimum design element for that, some minimum depth of commercial space, some minimum percentage of floor area. But right now, the focus of the discussion is whether or not to eliminate the current 2-story cap on residential occupancy and the 50% total square footage. So what we need to do is find a comfortable space, where you're comfortable requiring what should be the minimum commercial presence.
And I think we've had this discussion with Mark before in terms of Mark Barnhart before in terms of, well, what's, because we come from a planning and zoning perspective, we can kind of make up a number in terms of 25% of the whatever, or, a depth of whatever, but it would be helpful to know what's viable, what makes the most sense in terms of, does it need to be a leasable square footage of, I don't know, 1,500 square feet, 2,000 square feet? What's the most compatible configuration, I guess, would be the question. So, perhaps we need to do a little bit of homework, as long as the concept of this is acceptable to the board in terms of moving forward in this way. We can do a bit of homework to figure out, well, here's the scenario that's likely going to be the most marketable and beneficial.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. That we don't have to necessarily decide today what that ought to be, but if that's an important consideration, we can come back with some proposals. There are examples of regulations, particularly where there's structured parking, and then there's commercial space at the ground floor. Examples of regulations that require that parking structure, for example, be wrapped with commercial space to a certain depth so that it has the appearance of an occupied building rather than just an unoccupied, parking structure. So we can come back with some specific design elements there. Because I think as we looked at this in advance of today, it became apparent that I think is going to be important to define at least some minimum threshold. And we're happy to come back to that. But we just want to try to see if we're at least in the right ballpark with some of these other design elements, so we can kind of keep moving the ball forward here.
That makes sense, and I do want to call on other commissioners who wanted to speak. I think that the percentage of commercial might be too blunt an instrument, and the idea that you're discussing about what's the maybe there's a way to research and get insight into number one, the demand for the commercials, minimum leasable commercial space, and also ways to creatively talk about how we want the ground floor to look in terms of the mix of, unless the commercial space is going to be the entirety of the ground floor, the ways to creatively mix the commercial and the structured parking elements so that we get the look and feel that we want for the building. I think, am I mistaken that Commissioner Levy had a hand up?
I did. Yeah, I had a couple of questions. In terms of the zero setback, it provides for that on Sanford and Umpqua. What about the Post Road area? Do we need to address that as well?
Well, we certainly could. I think by and large in our downtown, with maybe a couple exceptions that I can think of offhand, the setback is generally zero. Along. We do have a provision in the regulations where the right of way is 100 feet in width, you can come to zero, but I don't believe the entirety of the post road frontage is 100 feet in width. So I think the majority of commercial structures have almost a zero setback. Maybe some of the brick walk ones are at 10 feet, but there's not. Our regulations presently prohibit parking between the building and the street. Question is, what's the right, setback for the building to be? The regulation now calls for a minimum of 10. And we can take a look at that to consider whether or not you want to extend that zero, potential to the post road.
Yeah. I mean, like right now, it appears that at least between Umpqua and Sanford on the post road, it appears to be zero. Is it in fact, or?
I think it is. I mean, we can double check that, but if it's not 0, it's certainly less than 10.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think we should, with an idea of, bringing the commercial forward and, in the, downtown area and being consistent, that we may want to consider extending that 0 along the post road.
Yep.
As to how far out from Umpqua we go or from, Reef Road, I'm not sure, but that's something we'd want to look at.
Yep. We can certainly get you more data on that.
Okay. And then in terms of the Donnelly Walk area, what exactly do you mean by a grade level plaza? Or what, I mean, is that like 10 feet with tables, or what is contemplated there?
I don't think we defined it. I think if you want to think back to the project that was proposed along there, the upper stories were at 0 setback,
Right.
but the bottom level was set back. And so it's really just optimizing what would otherwise be dead space with amenity space, in a way that adds to the vitality of Donnelly Walk. So, it's a way in which to wrap the building architecture that would front Umpqua onto Donnelly Walk, where there's storefront possibilities. And then for the area that is not utilized for parking or something else, that, where there's going to be a building that is 15 feet above it, or, whatever distance that is, based on our regulations, if it's the 15 feet, that's adequate headroom to be able to put planters and benches and, some sort of pedestrian amenity. And I don't know that we specifically defined it, but we just thought, well, if we add that language in there as an incentive in terms of that 0 setback, it would help define that grade level a bit better.
So, for instance, on the first floor, if you had commercial along Umpqua, and let's say it's going back 20 feet, then the remainder of the building might be 10-foot setback for a plaza. But then for the second floor, it might overhang and still have a 0 setback. Am I envisioning that correctly, or?
Yeah, I think that would be correct to the extent that 10 feet is not occupied by parking.
Okay. And I guess we need to sort of evaluate, I guess we basically want commercial on, shall we say, on Umpqua or Sanford. Would our regulations, or as this is proposed, would it allow for a 0 setback if the building went all the way through from Sanford to Donnelly? Would it be 0 on front and back?
Yes.
Okay. All set.
Very good. And I wanted to note that Commissioner Braun joined recently, so welcome. Other commissioners, comments on this proposed regulation in its current draft form? Commissioner Francis. You're on mute.
We can't hear you, Meg.
Right?
There you go.
Very good.
I like the rendering, Donnelly Walk, and I think it's a good idea to have Mr. Barnhart advise us what the demand is for commercial space. Because I think what you're saying is it might be commercial of a certain square footage with parking behind it if there's residential involved.
Yes, I don't think, in order to be able to try to balance the design requirements of creating the parking that's required to support the uses in the building, that the entirety of the footprint of the structure or the property could be occupied by building footprint. So it's either going to need to be structured parking or at grade parking somewhere on the site.
Yeah.
But we want the street front, commercial presence. So for the entire depth of any parcel, I don't think you're going to have occupied commercial space, because you need to have some footprint left over on the property somewhere to be able to park.
Yes,
The
especially.
question is, what, do we want to have,
Sanford.
we need to come back to you with some specifics on,
Yeah.
what's the appropriate minimum depth of commercial
Yeah.
space that might be
What is,
viable.
yeah, what
And
is
I think there's
getting
lots of
the demand
examples.
for?
We have I don't know the depth off the top of my head, but the building at, I want to say 2150 Post Road, affectionately known to some as the Wedding Cake Building, just west of downtown, has structured parking at grade, but there is a street front commercial space there. I mean, People's Bank had a branch in there for many years. I don't know what the depth of that space is, but it gives the appearance at the grade level that it's a commercial space, and then behind that is, on grade parking, and then there's structured parking, behind that and below it. So the trick is to get the right balance. What looks good? What do you want to see? I think is most importantly, how a building looks and feels is more important than, I think, than anything else. And we just need to find the best examples of what's the right commercial minimum depth. So it looks like a commercial building on the first floor, even if the entirety of the first floor isn't occupied.
And then I had one question on the photo you showed us of the Ruane Street building. You're trying to show the difference, 5 stories and 4 stories and setback. How deep is that setback for that loft? After the 4 stories, how much setback was that? Because we were talking about
I would speculate.
requiring 10 feet or something. That looked like more, is it?
I would speculate that is a bit deeper than that. Jim, what are your thoughts? Maybe about 15 on that upper level?
Is that all?
I don't know the answer to that offhand, but it's very easy we have the plans for that, so we can circle back. We have, a 10 foot as a placeholder because, we understood that it was important to the commission to have more setback above that third floor for 2 reasons.
Yeah.
One, it's going to reduce the visual massing of the building, and it could also create some really attractive amenity space, for tenants, which that Ruane Street building does. It does, those setbacks are occupied by pretty nice, exterior amenities for the particular units. So in short answer to your question, I'm not certain what the answer is. If you're not comfortable with 10 feet, we can propose a different number, but we can certainly circle back and let you know what those individual setbacks are in that picture. That's a good question.
I think we also wanted to move away from the more complicated calculation that we presently have in our regulations. So establishing a solid minimum, I think, is a better course of action than the calculation that's in our present regulations.
Very good. Other commissioners? Commissioner Braun, you're on mute.
Yeah, I just had a couple of things. Just considering if everything is built out the way the new regs would allow, is it possible to get a schematic of what it would look like with the 3 stories and then just the additional, 10 feet back for the 4th story? Do you think we need to maybe have 5 feet back for the 3rd story, or is it going to look like a canyon effect? That was one thing I was concerned about. Can we get a schematic of what it would look like if everything was built out to the max? How hard would that be to get?
Well, we can give you some kind of block examples. I think we had some from the materials that were used in our TOD planning discussions that we can go back to and provide, but that's not going to be like a rendering of what the entirety of the downtown would look like at 4 stories. If that's what you're asking, that would be quite a lift, and I'm not sure we'd be able to do that, but we could certainly get you some at least examples of what some of those might look like.
Yeah, well, maybe not the whole downtown, but a block totally built out. I'm concerned that if we're going to allow, the added residential, which we want, we should impose, perhaps more green space, more landscaping, more airspace in the top levels. I also was concerned by reducing parking requirements. Is there any ancillary plan to improve mass transit downtown so people can get back and forth without using cars? Like anybody, not just people that live there. Right now, I don't even know what the mass transit is. It's a bus that goes from Bridgeport. But is there anything in the works that would help people not have cars downtown for the long term?
Well, there's nothing beyond, I mean, there is a Greater Bridgeport Transit District line that runs up and down the Post Road. The idea of having folks live downtown would reduce the number of vehicle trips if they are obviously, going to businesses and restaurants. And it's been our experience with developments that are adjacent to train stations that there tend to be fewer cars. So hence the proposed reduction at 1 space per bedroom or 1.5 per unit. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about that later when we talk about the statutory changes that the legislature has put forth. But the short answer to your question is I'm not aware of any mass transit opportunities beyond the existing, obviously we have Metro North right there and the Greater Bridgeport Transit line.
And then I missed the first 15 minutes. I apologize, but can we get something from Mark Barnhart indicating what the possible impact could be if this gets pretty built out with a lot of units, of which only 12% are required to be affordable, meaning 88%, I don't know if my math is right, would be not affordable, and how that trajectory would get us farther away or closer to the target, whether for a moratorium or for the 10% target. It'd be.
Yeah, I can speak to that briefly.
Yeah.
Certainly the 12% units or 12% affordable units would move towards moratorium targeting. And realistically, if your goal, I know the state exemption goal is 10% of total number of housing units to be exempt from 8-30G. That's not a realistic goal in my view, and it's been demonstrated by the fact that there hasn't been a municipality in the state in the 30 years the statute has existed that's been able to achieve that didn't already have 10% at the time of the adoption of the statute. So it's kind of, it's a high bar that I think mathematically we're likely never to achieve. What we are likely to achieve is moratorium status, which is credit points based on the number of units, not as a percentage of overall units, but just as the credit points as making progress towards providing affordable housing. So I think we have to look at this more holistically than just achieving a 10% affordability threshold town-wide, because that's a threshold that, in my opinion, we're never going to get to.
It would. Mark gave us a really good synopsis about it. Had to be a year ago or 6 months ago. Is it possible to get an update on that, where we stand now with the affordable housing, the absolute numbers and the percentages and all that?
Yes, we can. We have a spreadsheet now that we can circulate if we haven't, that gives you the moratorium snapshot as, where are we? These are points that we think we get credit for today. These are points that if the developments are built, we would achieve, therefore achieve moratorium. I will tell you, and Mark will confirm that of the development proposals that have been authorized, if they are built, we're there. We have enough approved units that would amass enough credit points to achieve moratorium status. The issue is you don't get those points until they're actually physically built and occupied. So there is a lag between approval and achieving the points, during which, unfortunately, depending on your perspective, additional applications can be made. So
part of it was for this discussion, but part of it is because pretty much in almost every 8-30G application we review, the lawyer points out that we're getting worse instead of better, and it's confusing to anybody who doesn't understand that the ratio is only 30% affordable to 70% not affordable. So you can add absolute numbers in the hundreds or the thousands, but you could be potentially reducing your percent. And if we allow huge amounts of like 88% now, assuming there's a huge influx of rental units downtown, that will take us farther from that goal. And it will be used as an example of why we must, approve projects when it's kind of illogical when you think about it.
Well, the two things. Firstly, any project that has at least 10% or more than 10% affordable units is going to make progress towards that ratio. But secondly, again, unless you're at 10%, we're subject to 8-30G, regardless of where we are on that spectrum. If we're at 9% and we've built thousands and thousands of units to achieve 9% affordability, we're still subject to 8-30G, outside of the potential for an initial moratorium and then a second 5-year moratorium. I mean, until you get to that 10%, that sword is there. Whether we're at 2%, 3%, 4%, 5%, it doesn't change the threshold or the legal thumb on the scale that you're faced with. But any project that has 10% or more, and we're proposing 12 here, is going to make progress toward that ratio.
Thank you.
If I could also add too, I think that we do have to be mindful of the affordability aspects, of course, but that's not the sole reason to do this. Part of it is to diversify our housing stock. Anecdotally, we hear from the completed projects like, the Knights of Columbus site, that it's a lot of seniors who are, downsizing from their houses, so excited to move into downtown, be near the train station, be able to walk to restaurants. So there's a real need for folks who are in Fairfield to have different housing options available to them. So I don't think that we should lose sight of the affordability restrictions in terms of needing desperately this new diversity of different types of housing for folks.
Yeah, and just to expand on that a little bit, and again, as we've seen from these proposals, there's, the demand for units that people, when we did the market study with the TOD planning effort, there seemed to be a lot of surprise as to the very large number of units that our consultants said for which there was demand, and we are seeing these projects lease up very, very quickly. The other thing is we're trying to focus here on some sort of an option that gives a developer a different menu of opportunity, perhaps more than they can do today, but less than they could do under an 8-30G option. So we're trying to encourage, an investment or a development scheme that isn't a 100% residential occupancy under the affordable housing statute. Not that we oppose affordable housing. This commission has a very good recent track record of supporting affordable housing and in generating many more units. And this dovetails with that, but we're also trying to provide another option that's less that might be more palatable to the residents of the town, that has a mixed use component to it rather than being a solely residential development. So that's kind of part of this as well.
Very good. I just had a couple of thoughts and questions about the proposal myself, and then I think we can probably wrap up this portion of the discussion and move on. The first is, whether you, Jim, and Emily could speak sort of generally to the comparing and contrasting of your proposal versus the applicant's proposal for 15 Umpqua Road, which obviously received some positive commentary, but also some strong critique. And I noticed there's a couple of areas that jump out. Obviously, that your treatment at Donnelly Walk is different than what the applicant proposed. The setback of the 4th story obviously is different, and the the treatment of the setbacks, but I wanted to see if there's anything that you wanted to expand on and anything that I missed. That's my first question / comment.
No, in my opinion, I believe you're correct. The chief differences are the additional setback above the third floor level that was important to the commission, and if we're going to consider the full 0 on both sides, which was the original proposal, there ought to be some interface with Donnelly Walk. So I think, Mr. Chairman, you've identified the main differences. Unless Emmeline has anything else, I think you're completely correct.
I don't have anything to add, thanks.
Okay. And then, so the second question / comment is, we talked about, 0 setbacks as an incentive. And I think we're making a reasonable assumption that if we allow a minimum setback of 0, that the developer is going to take advantage of that to build out as far as possible. That's a reasonable assumption. But we also talked about, the look and feel of the building that we want. And, I'm obviously using 15 Oakville Place as a, 15 Oakville Road as an example, but in the area that will be subject to this, regulation change, the look and feel of the building that we want in terms of, the commercial space versus structured parking and so forth, and how it interacts with the streetscape. Are we approaching or experimenting with the idea of a maximum setback, for example? Because we could say you have a minimum setback of 0 on a particular side, and somebody could come to us and say, well, no, I'm going to do something completely different with the building that doesn't align with your goal in allowing a 0 setback. And so is there a need to have some sort of pictorial representation of what we do want them to do or what they must do with the setback? Form-based codes is sort of the extreme example of that, where you have pictorial representations of what is required for a building, and that's the zoning code. But we have areas in our regulations already where we have, for example, parking diagrams, and other regulations have diagrams for how structure should be laid out on a lot, or coverage diagrams and so forth. So is there a need for us to add pictures to our text?
That's a good question. Let me just respond to the first part of that, though, is we certainly could consider a maximum setback. We have a maximum setback provision in our Commerce Drive Area Design District regs that we can look at. But the other thing is we already have in our design, in our downtown community appearance and architectural standards that are already in the regulations, prohibit parking between the street in the building. So I think that restriction is going to create I think that's going to incent buildings to be closer to the street than farther back from the street. Because you push it back 30 feet and you still can't park there. There has to be some other thing. So, we can talk about that and either establish a maximum setback or better, additional language like we have in the Commerce Drive area, where whatever setback there is between the sidewalk and the street be provided with pedestrian amenities or a plaza or something. It may not be a bad idea to have a 5-foot or a 10-foot setback if within that setback it's publicly accessible space that is attractive street front. So I think I think you raise a good point, and I think we can propose some language that's not very far off from what we have in existing elements in our regulations.
Great. Other comments? So Commissioner Francis and then Commissioner Levy.
I'll make one more comment about just for input's sake. I would not be against 15% affordable housing component. I know we have 12 on the Commerce Drive, but I would not be against it to work towards our goal. I think it's very reasonable. It's certainly nothing 30.
Commissioner Levy?
Yeah, just one more question. The proposed 300% floor area ratio, will that allow for a 4-story building? I mean, previously we were 200% in 5 stories, but that could never mathematically be constructed. Is the 300% consistent with actually being able to develop 4 floors?
Well, it depends on how that's calculated. I think it can. It would if it not 4 of the same square footage floors. If you're occupying, 90% of your footprint of the lot at 4 stories, you're going to be over, 300%. Again, you need to create some footprint for parking. So what we are excluding from that is structured parking that's below grade. Structured parking above grade would count. So you're not going to get 4 floors that are all the same size, certainly. So you either have to set back, as we're requiring some element of setback for the upper floor, perhaps even more so, not to achieve the 300%, but it's going to be a balance of having to achieve the requisite parking while at the same time meeting the other codes. And I think you're right. And that's why, even though the regulations for many, many years have allowed for 5 stories, we only have really one 5-story building that wasn't an affordable housing application, because there was enough land there to create the surface parking that supports that square footage. So it's a long way of saying likely not.
So perhaps if we do want to be able to develop a 4-story building with the setbacks, maybe we have to consider a greater percentage, either that or excluding the sort of on-street or the street level parking from the calculation.
Yeah, we again, that was talked about during the TOD planning process, of bumping that number up to a higher number, and there was kind of pushback going above what we are proposing. So our thought was, the consensus was, hey, let's incrementally change that without, it's a 50% increase than what's permitted now. So we have to clearly define, what that is. Parking underneath the building at grade level that's not enclosed, could argue, is not part of the bulk of the building. But we also want to be careful that we have at least the minimum sized ground floor presence, so it doesn't just look like a building up on stilts.
Or we could ask for, if we give them the incentive of excluding 50% or all of the, first level parking, we can ask for something in exchange, like, mostly those things have to be ventilated in some way, shape, or form. We could ask for decorative grates, or, something. We could ask for something in exchange, for that FAR bump. Jim and I could do a little bit of research in terms of finding out whether, there's something out there that exists that would give them a little bit more in terms of the FAR. I see what you're saying, Steve, just in terms of the simple calculation of it. But, if we exclude it, I think we should exclude it based on being okay with the way that it looks, because FAR is really a visual requirement in terms of form. And so I think we have to be okay with giving them that.
So, for instance, if 50% of the first floor from behind was parking, we could exclude that from the ratio, but they would have to provide a suitable visual screening or some sort of decorative screening, so it looks nice.
Correct.
So is there consensus for, and Jim and Emily, do you have enough from the commission to go back and do a little bit of a retooling of the proposed reg for another planning meeting, that we could then basically give the green light to this proposed regulation in a new form for a move to public hearing. Is this?
No, I think so. I think the line of inquiry here, I think, is very helpful. So I think the short answer to that is yes. We need to do a bit more homework on a couple things. Clearly, the maximum or minimum commercial occupancy, whether 10 feet's the right number for setback, whether it be something different, and then when we do come back with something, we can try to come back with some of the examples that we used visually to help. When we did this TOD planning exercise, we'll go back to those materials and pull out some of the visuals that were part of that discussion. So, yeah, I think this is very helpful for us for the next steps forward.
Excellent. Great commentary from everybody, and great presentation from you, Jim, and Emmeline, both of you. So let's move on to item B2. There's one of you want to give us a brief introduction?
Yes. So we're going to go back to the PowerPoint briefly. So bear with us to kind of. What I first want to do is talk about what I gave you in the materials that we submitted with the agenda was the very lengthy public act that made lots of changes. I want to go over some highlights of some of the general changes, but what I wanted to spend time on mostly tonight is there's 3 areas within the statutes. Many of these, let me back up. Many of the things that are outlined in the statute are new requirements that we don't have discretion about, we need to comply with. There are certain other elements that we'll talk about that I want to spend the time where we do have discretion on whether or not we wish to comply with the statute. So before we get to that, I'm just going to highlight several of the general requirements. There was a lot of talk in the media and elsewhere about this whole removal of character with the neighborhood out of Section 8-2. And what the statute now says is that you can't deny an application solely on the basis of character, unless you've got clear and explicit physical characteristics defined in your regulations. So the word character of the neighborhood or the district doesn't hold sway. We need to have, and in many cases we do already, clear and explicit physical considerations to use. And this is really a reaction to case law in the land use bar that the court cases over the years, the courts have not held the character of the community to be a really to an objective standard. So they want us to be more specific. So that's a change that got a lot of press, but from my opinion, I don't think is a dramatic change for us because we have a lot of, like we just discussed, our downtown physical characteristics, and where they're lacking, we can certainly have the ability to insert more. The next change is there was a requirement now that we cannot establish a minimum dwelling unit size greater than that required by the health or building code. We talked about this at length when we were discussing our accessory apartment regulation, and this commission agreed ultimately to eliminate the minimum square footage requirement for our accessory apartments. And now the statute has taken that to the next level where we cannot have minimum floor area requirements. So we will be needing to modify some of our sections where we make reference to a minimum dwelling unit size. The next slide is, you may or may not have heard that there's now mandated commissioner training requirements. So starting on January 1st of 2023, commissioners will need 4 hours of training every 2 years, 1 hour of which will have to be on the subject of affordable or fair housing. There's an expectation that the state is going to roll out some training, and I would expect that, like the University of Connecticut already has a fairly modules for land use commissioner training that many of you have availed yourselves of, we'll be rolling out additional modules for online opportunities for you to log your 4 hours of biannual training. So you need to complete that by January 1 of 2024. So it's not like this is something you need to do tomorrow, but in the coming year, there's likely to be more information and more opportunity for that, and we will keep you informed on how that rolls out. But by January 1st of 2024, you will need to do 4 hours of training. Next, I want to get into, so I want to talk about accessory dwelling units, ADUs as they're described, and there's a lot of media attention on this, and some of you may be already well familiar with what the statute says, but the new statute requires regulations to designate districts where accessory apartments are allowed, provided at least one accessory apartment has to be allowed as of right on any lot that contains a single-family dwelling. And that's irregardless of what zone it's in. So where that differs from our standard is we currently prohibit accessory apartments in the beach district and in zones where we permit multifamily dwellings in our B and C zones. So that's a bit of a departure from what we currently permit. Our, in general, our regulations are pretty closely matched to what the statute provides, but there are some differences, which I'm going to point out. So again, the statute also requires that accessory units be either attached or detached. And there's been a lot of talk about this, and we've had attended several sessions with the drafters of the regulations in the state and the legislature. It's clear that the intent is that is the choice of the homeowner, that you have to allow both attached or detached ADUs. Presently, we only allow, as you I'm sure know, detached units in our 2-acre zone. So we do allow them, but only in the 2-acre zone. The new statute says you have to allow them wherever you permit an accessory apartment. The statute allows you to set a maximum floor area of not less than 30% of the area of the dwelling, or 1,000 square feet, whichever less. However, the regs can allow for larger, which ours do. Our present regulations allow 40% of the floor area up to 1,500 square feet. So we are in sync with the statute in that regard. You're not required, we can't require setbacks or lot size or building frontage that's greater than that for the principal structure. So I think for the most part, we're in compliance with that. We don't have a different setback standard for accessory dwelling units than principal dwellings because right now we only allow them in one district. So we can't have, there's certain provisions for architectural design that we cannot exceed. We can't require, for example, a passageway between the apartment and the main dwelling, an exterior door, except if it's required by code, more than one parking space. So we're consistent. We don't require those things now. So you cannot require a familial or marital relationship between the occupant of the building and the renter or of the member of the apartment. We don't, so we are consistent. The only areas where we may be out of sync is our requirement, recent requirement that the door, if there is a separate door, it has to have at least a 10-foot separation requirement and create the appearance of a single-family dwelling. And we presently require an annual affidavit to each year in the statute saying that you shouldn't have any kind of annual recertification process. So we are, for the, I would say the most part, consistent with what the statute says, but where we differ is that we permit accessory apartments only in single-family zones and presently not in the beach district, where the statute will require us to have them anywhere, and any lot where there's a single-family house, you can have an accessory apartment according to the statute. We only permit detached apartments in the AAA zone, and the statute says they can be anywhere that they're permitted. In those are the two big things, but the regulation provides for an opt-out provision that the commission has to either amend the regulations to comply with the statute where we differ, or vote to opt out of the statute no later than January 1st of 2023. If January 1st, 2023 comes and goes without opting out, and we have not amended our regulations to be consistent with the statute, the non-compliant regulation would be considered null and void, and the statutory language would prevail. So between now and January 1st of 2023, the commission needs to decide whether we want to opt out of these new statutory provisions and regulate ADUs or accessory apartments as we presently do, or make the necessary changes to the regulations so we're consistent with the statute.
Thank you, Jim. Do you mind if we stop there for?
No, I think that would be a perfect place to stop.
Okay, great. So it's hard for me to see people with the screen share up. So if you could either, yeah, okay. So that's helpful. So I see Commissioner Levy and Commissioner Corcoran.
Yeah, I had one question. What is is there any relation between maximum lot coverage and accessory units, or how does that work?
Yeah, we can't require a higher, what the statute says, if we have a set lot coverage requirement in any zone, we can't increase or decrease that lot coverage requirement, or we can't make it more onerous if there's an accessory apartment. So we don't. Our regulations say within the existing lot coverage requirements. We don't say if you're allowed 20% lot coverage for single family house, you still get that same 20% whether you have an accessory unit or not. What the statute says is you can't decrease that. If you have an accessory apartment, you only get 15% lot coverage. So you have to keep your design requirements on an equal playing field, and we presently do. So I don't think we are out of sync with the statute there.
So if you're in the beach area and your house already covers 25%, you would not be able to do an accessory unit, correct?
Correct. And if you need to, you have a maximum lot coverage requirement. So I'll look through that again, but I didn't see a requirement. What it says is you can't have setbacks. If you have a primary structure and your setback from the street, for example, or a side yard is 25 feet, you can't say you need 30 feet for an accessory apartment. You have to maintain that same 25 feet or less.
Mm-hmm.
And we're consistent there.
Okay. Thank you.
Commissioner Corcoran.
Jim, do you know the reason for this opt-out provision?
Well, I think the opt-out provision was a compromise that came out of the legislature because many towns like ours already have an accessory apartment regulation. Some don't. There are lots of towns that don't permit accessory apartments. So I think the opt-out provision was to kind of put towns to provide a legitimate reason for doing so, not just to opt out because we don't like what the state's putting forth. The idea here is to try to create more housing opportunity, which this commission has long recognized is needed. And we've had accessory dwelling units, 275 or so over the years that fill a needed role. So we're not looking to, but I think that was a nod that was a required compromise in order to get the legislation passed.
So if we opt out, can we leave our regulations the way they are?
We can, and that's the idea of the opt-out is you have to have a public hearing and to explain why you'd be considering opting out. And then once you vote to do so, if that's the way you want to go, then the Board of Selectmen, the town's legislative body, has to also choose to do so. So that it's not just I think what the legislature is trying to do is avoid a knee-jerk, stick your finger in your mouth and blow and say we're not gonna do what you're telling us to do. I think in large measure we stack up, but I do have some concerns, for example, of should accessory apartments be permitted in the Beach District, for example? That's a fairly unique geographical location that has floodplain issues and density issues that already cause certain issues, and that in and of itself might be a legitimate reason. I think so I'm just editorializing at this point, but that's.
Okay.
And if I could just add to that really quickly, I mean, there are 169 different municipalities in Connecticut. And what was very interesting is that there were a lot of the smaller places who, frankly, only have part-time planning staff. They don't have the capacity to pass regulation. And so there were some of those smaller towns who said, yes, please, 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 state of Connecticut, help us do this because we really have a need for our seniors to be able to stay in town and to attract some young people. But we just don't have the planning capacity to go through this planning exercise. I think that sometimes being the size that we are and as staffed as we are, sometimes we lose sight of those smaller places that just don't, they just don't have the ability to do this. So I think where my observation was where there was the largest pushback were from what I would say the medium to larger suburban communities who had stuff in place like Jim mentioned, and just didn't want that messed with. So I think that's where the opt-out provision came from is folks who already knew what they wanted and, you know, maybe had some regulations in place, but there's an awful lot of Connecticut that needs this regulation. So.
Okay.
Other commissioners? Commissioner Braun.
I agree with Jim that anything we do, we have to consider the coastal impact. I mean, we dodged a bullet with these last two hurricanes, but that's not going to happen every time. And I think almost anything we do from the post road down to the beach, we have to consider climate change, flooding, hurricanes, and everything else. And maybe even we could have a review by our engineering department or our conservation department on long-term impacts on our infrastructure and on where the future is going of the coastal, you know, shoreline. And that would include accessory dwelling units. I do think we could possibly, I remember we approved this. It was a good expansion. We could probably expand a little more, but I'm also concerned about expanding too much right in the coastal area. And then we could consider opting out. And there's these strict deadlines. It seems like it's far away, but there's a lot of steps to go through. So if we opt out, to me, that would be part of maybe an expansion of the ADU regulation that we passed, and then an opt out so we could do it our way. That's just my thought. Thanks.
Thank you. Other commissioners? I, for one, feel very proud of the expansion of the ADU regulation that we did very recently. I think, you know, Jim and Emmeline, you worked very hard on that, as did you know, the applicant, Affordable Housing Committee, Fairfield Senior Advocates, and Fair Plan. I think that while there are some intriguing aspects of the, you know, the default provision for ADUs that the legislature enacted, there's some things that in there that are worth exploring. I am not in favor of you know, having the default provision imposed on Fairfield by our inaction. So I, for one, would be interested in having an opt-out resolution drafted for the public hearing process, at which, you know, we could have a debate. I don't know whether there's anyone in this meeting tonight who feels strongly that we should change our regulations to match the state default, but that could certainly be the subject of debate at a public hearing, and then that, you know, that resolution would have to command a 2/3 majority of our commission and a 2/3 majority of the Board of Selectmen in order to pass.
I think the only thing that Jim and I as staff maybe wanted to ask is whether the commission felt very strongly about an annual review, because we find it tedious. Thank you.
Thank you, Emmeline. And Commissioner Levy?
Yeah, just one additional comment. While we may well consider an opt-out, we may also want to consider expanding to other districts, and you know, the possibility of having you know, accessory apartment units in more than just the existing district. So it could be a, as we're considering whether or not we want to opt out of this, we could also reconsider to what extent we want to allow for these alternative forms of housing, which are in such demand.
Yeah, and just to, and it was mentioned by, Kathy as well, in terms of, an expansion opportunity. I think the areas that you would need to consider is whether or not you want to expand a detached ADU opportunity in more zones other than the 2-acre zone, and whether or not you wanted to allow ADUs in the B and C residential zones where we prohibit them because those zones already allow for multifamily. But what the statute says is you don't have to permit it on a lot that already has a multifamily. You have to permit it on a lot that only has a single family. So if it's limited in that capacity, you could consider expanding it to the B or C zones that only have a single family dwelling, and would be limited to a single family dwelling should they have an ADU. So those would be the two areas, I think, where you would, could consider expansion should you wish to do so.
Very good. I recall we had quite a bit of discussion about whether to expand the detached ADUs beyond the AAA zone. And for one thing, we decided that, we would have to renotice the public hearing because it would expand, the people who would be affected by it. I guess one question I have is whether we have experience with the number of ADUs that have been constructed or proposed since we changed the regulation, because we thought of the expanding detached ADUs to the AAA zone as an experiment that we would see some results of. But I don't know whether we've had sufficient time for the experiment to.
Yeah, it's been fairly short period, as you mentioned, but there's only one that I can think of, and it was one that it was kind of in design while we were, it was an existing, I think it's an example of an existing detached structure that they wanted to convert. We certainly have examples of detached accessory apartments that existed prior to our even allowing accessory apartments, or they were grandfathered in. As there's plenty of old carriage houses or detached units. So we have probably more than a handful of existing detached units, but newly created since our adoption, I can only think of one. So, there was.
I think there's maybe 3, and that's it.
Okay.
3.
So not a huge number, and we didn't anticipate that there would be a big land rush to create ADUs. We're just trying to reduce barriers and give folks options. So if you wanted to consider, expanding that opportunity to other zones, again, I don't know that is going to be a huge push to do that. Most of the ones we see are for family necessity circumstances more than anything else, more than it being a rental opportunity. So I think that's fair. I think we should flesh out, if we are going to go down the road of considering opting out, we should have a further expansion or further dialogue on whether it's simply an opt out, or are we looking to, adopt maybe certain provisions of what the state is offering and opt out of others.
Very good. And perhaps
I'd like to just point out an important distinction as well. The state statute requires detached ADUs to meet principal dwelling setbacks, whereas for us, I think that we allowed our ADUs to meet accessory structure setback requirements.
Yep.
So that would be something else to think about if we were to expand that in other zones beyond the AAA. Right now, AAA sites are quite large, and so the accessory setback is significant from the property line. Whereas if you get into smaller residential zones, if we still apply that same accessory structure setback, once you get down into A and B zones, that's as small as 4 feet off the property line. So, I think we would just have to think about whether or not the location of that with accessory structure setbacks is something that the board feels comfortable with, or, if they'd rather, leave it for larger lots where that you're going to have a more sizable setback, even if we apply accessory structure setback requirements versus primary structure setback requirements as implied by the state statute.
Very good. So I guess one thing that comes to mind is, maybe it's a good thing that there hasn't been this rush to create a whole number of new ADUs, because one of the concerns and that we had in changing the regs the way we did was that, well, maybe we're going too far too fast, and we're going to create we're going to overly incentivize the creation of new ADUs because we did away with the 5-year look back or moratorium. But I wonder whether Jim and Emmeline, you have enough of a consensus from the commission to draft proposed regulation for another planning session rather than straight to a public hearing.
Yeah, my answer to that would be not quite. I'd like to see if we could, I don't know, you don't need to answer this today necessarily unless you have an opinion, but I think it would be important to know where you might all stand on the idea of other zones allowing detached opportunity and whether or not it's okay in the A, B, and C zones if there's only a single family dwelling that there can be an accessory. So those are the two areas if you have a strong opinion or not. I think I'm gathering that there is likely consensus that you would still favor prohibiting ADUs in the beach district. If I've misstated that sense, please let me know. But I think those are the areas where I think if we could quickly get a little feedback on those two topics, detached and allowing them in the B and C zone would be helpful.
Yeah, no, for sure, Jim. We're obviously we're down a couple of commissioners, but I think that so far I haven't heard anybody in favor of adopting the state default. So that's one area of somewhat consensus. Commissioner Braun did express concern about expanding detached ADUs to the beach district, which I think raises valid concerns of flood control and other issues. So, and then I think we did among our commission have interest in potentially expanding the detached ADUs beyond the AAA. And one thing that came to mind was the AA, right? So I don't know whether there's a sense of the commission as to how far to expand detached ADUs, and maybe we should have a brief additional discussion on that. Whether perhaps there's nobody who feels particularly strongly about it one way or the other. Commissioner Braun?
I think if we're going to go with the opt-out option, we should do something to expand, to justify opting out to the Board of Selectmen and to the RTM or whoever has to approve it after us. I do think that, sticking to setback requirements, there are a lot of odd shaped lots and large large lots in, other zones that could accommodate a separate ADU. And stay within setbacks. So I think that could be a way of expanding it to other zones without really worrying about it going right out to the property line and allow us the flexibility to do that. That could be one way of expanding it.
Okay.
Commissioner Levy.
Yeah, I also would be in favor of expanding it to other zones, including the A, B, and C. I'm not concerned about opening the floodgates to developers putting up 2 units on every property. I think in most cases, the expense of building a detached unit is such that it will be done in cases where there's familial need or, legitimate desire to allow for an accessory unit for family or, or for employees or something of that nature. So I would like to see it expanded and potentially allowing for more diverse, housing alternatives within the town without any concern that it's going to be, abused.
Thank you. Other commissioners? Commissioner Franson.
Did you call on me?
Yes.
Oh, I would agree with Commissioner Braun. I like the setbacks, and we could consider the A zone, but I don't want too much crowding in areas that are already pretty dense. All these little quarter-acre, half-acre things, they're dense enough.
Okay. So.
Okay.
It doesn't sound like we have consensus on the smaller lots, but we have some consensus for expanding ADUs.
Yeah, I mean, that's helpful. We can draft something because what I'm hearing is there's an appetite for additional opportunity for detached, but using the primary dwelling setback standards. And maybe in the smaller, again, smaller zones, but I think if we can draft something that you can always decide to contract once things are adopted, so we can take the broadest look at this as a potential opt-out procedure, adding other opportunities consistent with the statute as suggested. So it's a balanced approach that we're not just opting out, that we want to continue our opportunity to provide diversity housing stock. So I think that last couple of minutes helps get us to where we need to be to get you a draft for consideration.
Very good. And to Emmeline's point, I have no objection to you including a provision that deletes the recertification requirement. Very good. All right.
I always liked the cluster concept that Carrie Makeover presented a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
If we could find 2, 3, 4 acres, it was a lot of senior housing, and real village concept. I thought that was a great idea, but you do need some land.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it is a good concept, but it's kind of outside the scope of the ADU regulation.
Yeah, it's very intriguing.
Thank
Should
you.
we get
That was very helpful. The next piece is, we don't necessarily need to put a graphic up for this, but it's up. So there is a requirement now in the statute that we cannot require more than 1 parking space for each studio or 1 bedroom, or more than 2 parking spaces for a 2-bedroom or larger. So, I think this requirement has fairly limited applicability for us for a couple of reasons. We require 2 parking spaces per unit for 1 to 4 families. I don't think there's going to be folks building single-family houses with 1 bedroom. It's just the market forces aren't going to do that. We might see that in a more dense TOD development, for which we already have a lesser parking standard than is being prescribed here. So let me just see. So this would really have more applicability in our condominium development regulation, our design residence district. We haven't seen a whole lot of activity in that regulation, but right now, if you have 4 units or more, we require 2.5 spaces up to 10 units, and then 3 spaces per unit greater than 11 units. Our transit-oriented district already permits less parking than it's the lesser of 1 space per unit, as we just discussed downtown, 1 per bedroom or 1.5 per unit, whichever is less. So where we have already accepted the higher density developments, we already have a lesser parking standard. We do require more than 2 spaces per unit in private condominium type developments that have more than 10 units or even more than 4 units, but that's kind of be market force. The idea behind this statute is the theory is that onerous minimum parking standards increase the cost of providing housing. So the idea behind this statute is to reduce the cost of house production to make it less expensive. And one way to do that is to require fewer parking spaces. So, in a single family subdivision, I can't imagine that anyone's going to build a single family home that only has 1 bedroom, in which case we could only require 1 parking space, where our regulations in any single family district now require 2 per unit. So we're consistent for the most part, and where we run afoul is in like I said, in the design residence district, if you've got 35 units or 12 or even 12 units, 12 2-bedroom or more units, we require 3 spaces per unit, where the statute would say we can't require more than 2 spaces per unit. So I don't think there is a huge impact for us should we adopt the state prescription here. But again, there is an opt-out provision here. There is no deadline, oddly enough, for this opt-out. You can opt out at any time. Arguably, the statute was effective, will be effective October 1st. So arguably, we won't be able to require more than 2 spaces per unit after October 1st, unless we opt out. But there's no deadline, no hard, if you decide down the road 2 years from now to opt out, you can do so. So this, to me, we're not as out of sync with this as it might first appear, but that's all I have on this. So we can kind of open it up for discussion, whether you think we should consider opting out of this or just complying with the no more than 2 spaces for a 2-bedroom or larger dwelling unit.
Thank you, Jim. Commissioners, Commissioner Braun.
I would like to opt out only to give us the flexibility to do what we need to do without being bound. We're already bound by 8-30G, which has, no ability to manage anything. So if somebody wants to put affordable housing in, they can do whatever they want. But for everything else, I think we should continue to control it the way we see best. So I would prefer to opt out by October 1st if possible. Thanks.
Other commissioners. Commissioner Francis. Oh, sorry, I can't hear you. Meg.
We can't hear you.
Can't hear you, Meg.
I would totally agree with Commissioner. Our parking is a problem in this town, and our regulations are not that strict at all.
Is there anyone who wishes to, wait and see or adopt the state standard? Commissioner Levy?
Yeah, I'm just curious. It sounds like our current regulations only require more than the 2 spaces per unit in, let's say, a condominium development, where if it's over 10, you might need 3 per unit. What is the reason for requiring additional parking in sort of, let's say, a 15-unit condominium where you'd need 45 spaces then?
Yeah, well, that was just what the commission intended. We even go beyond that and even require in certain, a half a unit of additional visitor parking per unit. So, in my opinion, I think parking for that type of development is somewhat self-regulating, that if a developer wants to provide more than 2 spaces per unit because it thinks it's worth more and they've got the land to do it and it might help their property value, that they can certainly have more parking than what we require. I think in my personal opinion, the more than 2, 2.5 spaces up to 10 units, then more than 3 or 3 spaces beyond 10 units was perhaps, my personal opinion is I think that's a bit of an overreach, but that was part of a contraction of the design residence district to when there was a time when there was a lot of blowback about there being too many multifamily housing developments considered, this is going back 20 plus years, so that was what the commission wanted to do at that time to demand that there be the requisite parking, because most of the units, I think the theory was that when garages are provided, that those spaces tend to become storage areas and folks don't necessarily use their garage to actually park their vehicles, and there's a need for more on-site parking than what might happen in a private garage. But again, we haven't seen a development of that magnitude in the design residence district for a very long time. The most recent one was for an age-restricted development downtown that had more parking than what's prescribed by the statute. So in my view, I think it's, the state requirement would have limited impact, but I understand the idea of, hey, if there's an opt-out, let's do it. But in many cases, we already provide, you know, again, in our transit oriented, where our biggest developments are, we already prescribe less parking.
Here's a question. So in our design business district proposed regulation change, which we spent, you know, a good bit of time talking about today, we are reducing the parking requirements, right, as recommended by the TOD study.
Correct.
Would this be an appropriate place to put in an opt-out provision from the state default, or does that complicate the regulation, overcomplicate the regulation?
Well, I don't know that I would put it there, because in that proposal, we are prescribing a parking standard that's less than what the state is saying we can't can do. So I think it's more general that you would either decide whether you want to opt out of this or adopt the state prescription.
So it would be a standalone,
separate from the TOD reg.
Yeah, so it would be a standalone resolution that we'd vote on, you know, just as is. Okay. I'm not hearing anybody who is strongly in favor of adopting the state default. I don't know that there's tremendous applicability to the state default, but certainly, you know, after October 1st of this year, any development, any application that adheres to that minimum standard has to be approved in that respect. So I guess the consensus seems to be that we should draft an opt-out provision, a standalone opt-out provision for public hearing and debate.
Yeah. Okay. We can bundle that if we're gonna, pursue an opt-out provision for ADUs. We can kind of bundle that together, so we'll have a opt-out night.
Yeah, I was trying to think about how that could be administratively eased. You know, the burden could be eased administratively of you guys having to.
To Commissioner Braun's desire, realistically, I heard you, but I don't think that there's no way physically we're going to be able to do this by October 1. But I'm not aware of any applications in the hopper that would be affected by this proposal.
Is it the same process?
It's the same procedure as prescribed in the ADUs, 2/3 vote of the commission, and then followed by a 2/3 vote of the legislative body, where the legislative body is a town meeting, then it becomes a board of selectmen. So yes, same process.
Okay, so moving on to cannabis.
Okay, this is a different statute that I did not provide you the entire text of because it's over 300 pages long, and it's what I'm going to boil it down to are the land use pieces to this. You may know, and I'm sure that the Adult Use Cannabis Act allows, as of July 1 of this year, for people to possess in certain things, and there's lots of strings attached to all these things that I'm not going to get into because it's not within our realm. But specifically, this statute defines several classes of adult use cannabis establishments, and basically boils down to this from a zoning perspective. That the commission has to make an affirmative decision to either permit certain of the cannabis establishments by regulation in how they are going to be permitted, or you can choose to ban them. Historically, back when the medical marijuana, the medical marijuana statute was passed, the commission did have an application to approve a dispensary, and the commission made a finding that it wasn't a permitted use. We have a provision in our regulations, as many towns do, that it says that if unless a use is specifically permitted by regulation, it's deemed to be prohibited. We did not have specifically a definition for a medical marijuana dispensary in the commission. The commission's position was, since we didn't make an affirmative stance to approve it and adopt it, it's therefore prohibited. and the dispensary regulation was denied. This statute's a little different, and I think as a result of the medical marijuana experience in many towns taking the position similar to that Fairfield did, if it's not permitted, it's prohibited, requires you specifically to declare it one way or the other. Failure to adopt a regulation or failure to define it means by statute that it's presumed to be zoned as if, in quote, as if for any other similar use. So I think the decision here is, and again, this is not necessarily you need to decide tonight. May of 2022 is when retail sale licenses are going to be offered by the state. So sometime between now and next May, we need to decide whether any of the list of defined cannabis establishments ought to be permitted in some fashion, and if so, in what zones and what's the permit process, or whether you wish not to permit them. And if you choose the latter, there's, you need to specifically define it. And there was in the guidance document that we had provided to you that was prepared by the Naugatuck Valley Council of Governments, there's the example of language that can be done. There are a number of communities already that are discussing this. Some have already taken action. There's at least 5 towns that I'm aware of that have already acted to ban. There are several others that are considering year-long or multi-year-long moratoriums to consider it. For example, Greenwich, Newtown, Prospect, Avon, and Southington are all examples where a ban. Newtown specifically said, well, we're banning it in our regulations, but understand that we might lift that ban down the road should we change our mind and wish to regulate them in some fashion. So we're not, this statute requires us to take an affirmative stance one way or the other. Are there among the menu of cannabis establishments those that you wish to permit and where, or do we not want to permit any of them? So those are really, the option that's put before you from a land use perspective from this Adult Use Cannabis Act.
Very good.
So you can probably take that screen share down, Emmeline, and we can.
Okay. Commissioner Levy.
Yeah, Jim, I think Westport has permitted cannabis retailers for medical use. Are there certain towns you're aware of that have permitted it, and what sort of experience they've had?
There are, I want to say, oh shit, I have, hang on a second, I've got this written somewhere. Statewide, I think there are, because there was a limit to how many licenses the state was going to grant initially. I believe there are 18 dispensaries statewide and 4 cultivators. I know Milford has 2, 3. I'm not familiar. I understand there to be one in Westport. I'm not familiar with its operation, and perhaps the fact that I'm not speaks to the fact that it hasn't raised a lot of media attention, although I don't frequent Westport. Maybe some of you are more familiar than I. But I don't have a great depth of experience to tell you. Emmeline can maybe offer some anecdotal evidence or discussion on the Milford examples.
Yeah, I can only tell you that I was with the city of Milford when dispensaries were reviewed for medical marijuana, and the requirements from the state of Connecticut are really extensive. So we had obviously parent communities who were a bit concerned. These establishments are very quiet. We have a standalone facility in Milford. We have one that's within a shopping center, and they're very quiet retail uses, and they have a lot of security. I don't know if you've read the state requirements in terms of all of the security that they're required to install. So it's a very I don't know what to compare it with. It's most of these are cash operations. So there's, there's camera requirements, there's all of these various doors that lock. You have to have appointments. It's my recollection is it's a very extensive list of requirements that you have to meet by the state, even to open as a retail medical facility. So I'm interested to see one of the reasons why I think the retail can't open for a full year is they have to come up now with what those requirements for operation are going to be, just like they did for medical dispensaries. Is there a certain requirement for a level of security, cameras, back doors, that type of thing, that they had in place for the medical dispensaries. So I think, to Jim's point, I think there are a lot of municipalities who are asking their boards and commissions to look at moratoriums in the short term while they wait and see what those requirements are going to be, passed down from the state, and then also how other towns, the ones that maybe have had a positive experience with the medical dispensaries, are looking to, add those to their regulations. So, I think that there's a lot of uncertainty right now.
Yeah, I would agree that I think anecdotally from what I'm hearing, that many of the towns that are considering and a lot of towns that haven't even discussed this yet, but the towns that are considering moratoriums are largely because they're waiting to see how the licensing process is going to flesh out. It's a very complicated statute, and I don't think they've fully fleshed out the licensing procedure yet that needs to come down, and that is in large measure why some towns are kind of taking the, hey, let's put this off a year, or at least be a year beyond the May 2022 offering of licenses until we get a better handle on how this is going to roll out. So I think that's in large measure why some of the moratoriums are being put forth.
I agree, Jim and Emily. I think that the wait and see approach is being advocated by some towns because of, number one, the interest in seeing how the regulations are going to be developed at the state level and what the experience is going to be once these retail outlets become more common and there is some experience with them and the regulation of them. And on the flip side of the coin is concern that if a retail outlet applies to the municipality for a zoning permit before regulations are in place, and that by default they will be permitted to do that to the same extent that they would be able to do it with a similar use, however that's going to be interpreted, right? So it's as you said, Jim, it's the legislation puts the burden on the municipalities to opt out or to impose moratoriums to avoid the default of permitting these. So there is some appeal to this sort of safety in numbers or wait and see approach that some municipalities have taken. Others have taken the step of saying we are permanently banning this use, or we're permanently banning it until further notice, as you mentioned, with Newtown, right? So, and I have great respect for the planning authorities in all of those jurisdictions. Everybody's figuring this out. But I personally, I'm not ready to take the step of saying this is something that we are going to permanently ban until the next zoning commission revisits it. I do think there's some. I do think it's worthwhile discussing the possibility of a moratorium to get more information about how this is going to be experienced in practice. Other commissioners? Any other comments on cannabis? I don't know that we have. I don't know that we have more than the voices of myself and Commissioner Levy, and neither of us took much of a position. Should we revisit? I mean, go ahead.
I would just agree with your statement.
I'm sorry, Meg, we didn't hear that.
I would just agree with Commissioner Brayman's statement.
That you would favor a short-term moratorium until we see how the state regulations shake out?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm on board with that too.
Okay. Okay.
In terms of the length of the moratorium, I don't feel strongly. I think it could be, I think it could be short enough for us to simply see, what other towns are doing, how the state is regulating.
Yeah, I have two schools of thought on that personally. You can set whatever time frame you like. Let's just say, for example, it's going to be a 2-year moratorium or a year beyond May of 2022 to go to May of 2023. If sometime between the establishment of a moratorium and that end date, you can adopt regulations and extinguish the moratorium in advance of its current deadline. The other side of the coin is kind of like the Newtown model. Is you can vote, propose to ban it, and then later on decide to adopt regulations, and modify, and change your exclusion to inclusion as part of a regulatory amendment. So you can, the choices are yours. But if the idea is to not foreclose the possibility, and let's see how this shakes out, and which seems to be kind of a common action, I personally would recommend a year beyond the May 2022 date. Again, if sometime between then, the risk is if we don't do anything by May, whatever the terminal date of the moratorium is, it becomes assumed to be permitted. So whatever deadline is set, should there be a deadline, we would need to have a regulation ready to go by that date, or adopt a ban. I don't believe there's a deadline like the ADU requirement to ban it, that after a certain date you can't ban it. So where I'm going with this is you need to be careful on a moratorium that you set a long enough deadline so that you don't default into the regulation by not taking action before that deadline.
Commissioner Levy.
Yeah, I would agree with perhaps a 1-year moratorium. I think if you ban it, or if it's much longer than that, the issue that does need to be addressed will never get off the back burner. So I think 1-year moratorium would be an appropriate, hiatus, but still keep us focused on the issue.
And should that be the subject of another planning session, or is it? I think I guess my inclination is that if we could have that, because we need to have another planning meeting anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that could be the subject of a discussion in the next planning meeting, which could be part of our regularly scheduled agenda too.
Yeah, again, it's not complicated to draft language for that. I can read you Trumbull's language just so they're sad to get rid of to do it. It's not complicated. It's just deciding on what your terminal deadline is going to be, with the understanding that you need to take some action, before that time frame. So we can, in conjunction with the other elements of the TOD reg we need to work on to get to you, by the time we turn that around, we can kind of package everything up with some language that gets us where we need to be.
Sounds good to me. Commissioner Levy?
Yeah, and maybe not by the next planning meeting, but at some point, whether it be staff or some other, board or, town personnel, if they could provide us with information, whether anecdotal or research, as to, what sort of facilities are being opened or could be opened, what the impact is, what sort of, service they provide, the pros and the cons, basically more information on what would be involved in terms of the various alternatives of what would be proposed and what we would either be allowing or banning. So I'd like to find out more about what's really at stake here.
Yeah, the interesting thing is, if you look at, there's some definitions included in that guidance document that was prepared by the Naugatuck Valley of Governments. And one thing that's at least in the legislation now is at least until 2024, say you wanted to permit any and all types of establishments, the statute caps how many you can have presently at no more than one establishment per 25,000 residents. So for Fairfield, that would be 3. They could change the legislation beyond after 2024 to increase that number. So that may be a bit of a moving target, but in the shorter term, up until 2024, we would be capped at no more than 3 establishments.
Interesting.
So it's complicated. I profess that I have not read all 295 pages of this particular statute. I've been trying to compile whatever guidance. We're happy to have the guidance document that MetroCog forwarded us that Naugatuck Valley Council of Governments do. So we're, there's a lot of discussion going on amongst peer communities out there. So there will be a growing body of knowledge that we can hopefully tap into and share, especially if we go down the road of a one-year moratorium, that we will be able to compile a better body of knowledge for you as this evolves.
Excellent. Other business? All right. Any other commentary? If not, I'll adjourn the meeting. And thanks to staff and to the commission and everybody else.
And I want to thank the commission as well for their thoughtful and helpful guidance. And hopefully we can turn this around and continue this dialogue. So we thank you for your time and attention.
Great. Good night, all. Thank you.